All right, welcome to another episode of the COVID-19 policy series here at the O'Neill School's YouTube channel. I'm Justin Ross, and with me are Professors Coady Wing and Denvil Duncan. Denvil and Coady, I think we all agree that there's going to be a recession. So I think the questions we should try and work out this week is with what is about how this recession might affect people. You know, how it might affect the things like outside of their stock market portfolio. Things like how it might affect their health, their investment in their education, what might be the experiences people have as they get out there on the job market. So maybe a good place to start with is just what we might know now about recessions in general. This is a pandemic recession, and the pandemic itself might kill you. But what do we know about how recessions affect people's health?
So I think there are lots of ways, independently of coronavirus, that a ensuing recession might affect people's health, and this time could be pretty different from the past. It's hard to know. One thing that economists have studied in the past is just different versions of the correlation between unemployment rates and mortality rates. And a somewhat counterintuitive finding is that when the unemployment rate goes up, mortality rates tend to go down. And they go down, not an enormous amount, but roughly speaking, about a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate in a state will tend to reduce the mortality rate in that state by about 0.5%.
Huh.
Okay.
Well, that is surprising because I would think that things like suicides might go up or something else like that.
That's right. I mean, it's a bit counterintuitive, and so people react to this and kind of have, there's a million ways that you could get a relationship like this. But two things that people usually come up with if you sit there and ponder it for a minute is, well, maybe working is just bad for you or is stressful, and so when you stop working so hard, maybe you spend a bit more time on personal care. Maybe you eat better. Maybe you don't smoke as much, and you work out more. And those things translate at the population level into some better health outcomes and therefore reduced mortality. It's one kind of story.
Yeah.
Another
that
story
does not seem to be my experience so far, how I'm weathering this great
well,
recession.
This time could be different. Here you are in your chair, okay, outside. It's hard to say. There's a fascination with baking bread and kind of home cooking, and we three certainly eat lunch together less often. Maybe that's good for our health in one dimension and bad in another.
So I imagine you're going to give us maybe another mechanism through which health effect might arise, but I'm thinking in the context of the current pandemic, if we were to stick to this first mechanism where I stop working, but I still have access to all the other things that I used to do and even things that I didn't have time to do. Whereas in this situation, I stop working, but you're also simultaneously shutting off all these other things that I am, I can't go.
But I would normally do with my time,
right? I'm at home. I can't go out. I can't meet my friends. So there are all these other factors that would exist in a normal recession that we're kind of turning off at the same time in this one. So I kind of wonder to what extent that effect might actually get muted in the context of COVID.
I think that's exactly the right way to think about it, for sure. Like, in what sense, what was causing these correlations to begin with, and that maybe gives us some insight into whether this time will be different.
Yeah.
Let me tell you the other mechanism first, and then let's talk about what should be different in the two, because I think the other one might be worth bearing in mind too. So the first idea was maybe work is just bad for you and it's better if you don't work so much. A corollary to that might be, that's nonsense. Have you ever seen somebody who lost their job? They're very sad and depressed, and that looks bad for your health too. So it's not obvious that work is just straight bad for everybody. Those have less money, less prestige. You're worried about everything. So it could be stressful to lose your job.
Right.
The other mechanism that could explain why mortality rates might go down is it's not to do with your job at all. It's that everybody else is not working. And so, you know, when you drive wherever you want to drive to the grocery store, or if you kept your job, you drive to the office, there's fewer cars on the road. And there's fewer cars on the road, there's fewer car accidents. So you don't die in a car accident anymore because the roads are not so dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people, maybe they die. There's some deaths every year that are due to high levels of pollution. It's not like there's a pollution event and it kills you, but pollution is bad for you. And some people are sort of pushed over some threshold and it, you know, kills them basically. And if we lower the level of pollution, fewer people will die for those causes. So there's a bunch of ways that just the aggregate level of economic activity might have some benefits to your health. And those things could happen even if personally you would be less healthy if you lost your job, right?
So that's why, from a research perspective, we might not be able to do something like you know, like the CDC would do, is like, well, okay, who died, and then, you know, were they laid off or harmed by the economy? This would be mechanisms by which they would die without actually experiencing, say, like, you know, the unemployment from it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, you might look at people who kept their job and the unemployment rate around them went up and down. Of course,
Right.
That could be one story. Another thing is you might ignore the macroeconomic events, and there are some studies that look at people who lost their job during a mass layoff. So it's not like they lost their job probably because they were personally ill or something like that. Everybody at their company all lost their jobs at once. And you could look at the health. So, you know, there's no recession. These guys just all lost their jobs sort of more randomly, quasi-randomly. You could look at the mortality rates or the health events for those people. And in those kinds of studies, you usually find that it's bad for you to lose your job. Right? Mortality rates go up. A bunch of other measures of mental health and well-being, they worsen, right, when you personally lose your job. And so that goes against the story that we're all just healthier if we don't have to worry so much about working all the time.
Yeah.
But that can happen even though the macroeconomic effects on overall health could be positive, at least in the short run, because because fewer traffic accidents and things.
So they're like in a horse race against each other. So like the people who are sad are maybe perishing,
making it worse
quickly.
Then,
but you know, there's also people not, you know, getting hit by cars and stuff, or
that's right,
not experiencing
and so
pollution.
So this is where Denvil wanted to go. So we should do this now. So historically, if I take these time series data and just look at the way that mortality rates change along with levels of unemployment, the net effect in the past between these two things pushing against each other has been that recessions are good for mortality, reduce mortality by a bit, right? The question is, this time we're about to see a big boost in unemployment probably. Are we about to have fewer deaths or more deaths? And why will it be different this time? There are some obvious reasons. For one thing, there's the reason for the recession, the root reason for the recession is that there's a giant health shock that indeed kills people. So like that's probably going to push up the mortality rate.
Yeah, that's not a traditional recession. We haven't had very many examples where people's health caused the recession. It's usually the recession causes the health effects. Yes, yeah. Right.
Correct. So that's one part that's pretty different this time, is that the health event itself is damaging to mortality rates. Another thing though is that this recession, probably so far anyway, has seen us do a lot more contraction of social activity than the normal recession has seen. So if you think that the main reason we were seeing health benefits is reduced traffic, then a year from now when we have updated data on a lot of these things, I bet traffic accidents are going to go way, way down, because traffic is certainly way, way down, right? Maybe it's down far more than a typical recession. So we might get an extra large reduction in traffic accidents.
And we're recording this on April 23rd, and it's big in the news that the future prices of oil have actually turned negative, right? Contract futures.
For some, right? The
I'm baffled by that a little bit. I realize there are
explanations. Well, it's not the spot
stuff,
prices. It's not the spot prices. It's the contract futures, right?
But the price.
Nevertheless, that's like a
I
big plummet in demand. Gas is now at like, 99 cents a gallon or something like that.
Yeah,
Quite low.
and yet nobody's driving. So like it doesn't. That should push against it. We should get back on the road. It's so cheap, but apparently not.
The rebound effect is probably being hampered by these stay-at-home orders and shelter-in-place orders. Like,
apparently, this is where the negative price event comes from, right? It's to do with storage capacities, right? You're not selling the oil, so where can you put all the oil right now? It's the same problem in my own house, right? We filled up both our cars because such cheap gas, But like, how many extra cans of gas am I going to buy to stockpile this sucker while the price is low?
The tank
Not
is
that
full.
many. I mean,
No, yeah. And then there'll
I'm
be a
not set
fire
up
in your.
for that kind of thing,
That's right. Then you'll have a fire in your house and threaten your house.
Exactly,
Right?
it's not a good idea.
But yeah, it's interesting just how many things are different this time around, because like you said, it's, I was mentioning before, the gym is closed. I can't go there. So unless I have some way of working out at my house, I'm, that mechanism is more or less turned off. But it occurred to me as you were talking that there's another thing that's happening here, right? So we've also heard in the news stories of people not seeking treatment for other forms of illnesses that they would ordinarily seek treatment for in light of what's happening. And so we might expect to see increases in those sources of death, right? So
I think that's a worrisome. It's tricky, because so far the data sets that you normally use to study things like that they're pretty detailed, but they come out with quite a lag. I mean, you don't usually get access to them for like a year or two after they actually happened. Maybe you could speed up and get them really fast right now if you were really pushy with hospitals and stuff, but they're busy with other things.
Yeah, they're busy.
Right. But so like, that seems like the kind of thing you could totally study. I don't know. Right now what we have is kind of anecdotal evidence. It's probably true, but it's hard to verify. But this idea that what is happening, and it could have a few different mechanisms, but the idea that like, for one thing, all the experts are telling us, stay at home, don't go outside. It's a dangerous, bad idea. You're harming other people, probably harm yourself. Just stay home. It's a responsible thing, right? And at the same time, even if you don't go in for all that, you're like, I can't think of a worse place to go and hang out right now than a hospital where the people all might have coronavirus. That's, it's like that and a cruise ship, two places you should totally avoid, right? And so for those two reasons, one, like you feel bad, like you shouldn't go, and two, maybe the place is harmful, you decide I'll just tough it out with whatever my health problem is, right? I think an interesting question is, health economists sometimes think a lot of healthcare is what we call flat of the curve healthcare. You don't really need it. You go, you spend a lot of money. It hardly improves your health because you weren't that sick to begin with. And like a lot of our healthcare is like that. We know all of it's not like that. There's all kinds of things that are like life-saving. You have to have it, right? It has huge benefits. But we also do a lot of stuff that's maybe a little bit pointless.
I've heard the advice before from health economists, like you should maybe only go to the hospital or the doctor when you think you would be willing to pay for it out of pocket. Not that you necessarily have to, but if you thought that you'd be willing to pay for this out of pocket, then you should go. That should be roughly your decision criteria because of some of the things that you say, right? Like you're likely to go sit in the ER and get a,
there are bad things could happen to you at the hospital. Exactly. Yeah. Except what's tricky about this, of course, is like, well, I don't know if I'd be willing to pay for it. I don't even know what's wrong with me or what the treatment is or whether it would work. Like what if I go and they're like, yeah, it's easy. Actually, what you do is take this pill for 2 weeks and you'll never feel like that again. And you'll be like, outstanding. I was very willing to pay for that. Other times you go like for hundreds of therapy sessions and you're like, man, nothing happened. I feel exactly the same as always before, right? You don't know this going in. So like healthcare is very difficult, but still, we think there's some flat of the curve. So one thing is if everybody just decides that they'll tough it out and stay home, and we don't see that induced a big increase in mortality, well, then we'll know that a lot of that stuff was wasted, pointless care, perhaps, right? It'll be hard to separate from the giant coronavirus event that was happening at the same time, but still, that's interesting. Another fear is that some of these things that we're talking about, like in the newspaper articles, there are physicians at hospitals saying, you know, there's usually some appendicitis patients every week, but not this week. That's weird, right? When they say things like that, you know, maybe they have an isolated case, or the, you know, they're cherry picking. Maybe there were cases, they just didn't think of them. I don't know. But like, suppose that's true. They're probably right. Their sentiment, right?
Yeah.
You can't not have your appendix out if you have appendicitis and gets out of control. Obviously, you'll die, right? It's not flat of the curve. And they're suggesting there's just a natural rate of these. If you take a population of several million people, some of them will have appendicitis at any given time, and there'll be it's like a steady business. You know, you're just doing maintenance on the population. If that's how it works and it goes down, you're like, well, they're still out there. So in a week, people are going to come in here with the worst case of appendicitis that you've ever seen. It's going to be a catastrophe because they waited too long now, and it'll be a big mess. And it's harder to treat and less effective, and the recovery time is longer. It's a bad idea to wait, right? And there could be a lot of conditions like that, right? People could be having some kind of mild heart attack, and they like tough it out, which is a stupid idea. They shouldn't do that, but they don't know, and they are afraid of going to the hospital. But eventually it's going to get bad enough they are going to have to show up because they'll be like incapacitated. And that, you know, there could be a lot of health damage from that kind of thing, that people they're trying to weigh the costs and benefits of going to the hospital right now, just like Justin suggested. Would I be willing to pay? Well, I don't know. The risk of getting infected with coronavirus at the hospital just went up. Maybe I should go less. And then they sort of err on the wrong side of that equation. If that happens, that's a bit of a tragedy. And I guess there are worst case scenarios where there gets to be pent up demand. You could have some medium-sized city where they're not having a coronavirus outbreak yet. They're just holding their breath and waiting for maybe it to happen. And everybody's avoiding the hospital. And then coronavirus starts happening and pent up demand releases all at the same time. And they're totally flooded now with both appendicitis and coronavirus at the same time. That's a bad idea. So those are scary scenarios. I don't know. Those are all just guesses, weird things that could happen, but they seem recession in your health, but they're more like unique to the coronavirus event than, I don't think they were a problem in previous recessions so much, you know?
So I guess if we go back to the mechanisms at work, so there is everyone else is not working, therefore I'm less likely to be hit by a car because fewer cars are on the road. And there is I'm laid off, so now I have time to do all kinds of things that will improve my health. And we figure some of those things are now kind of shut off. So it seems, this is not necessarily an empirical base, we're not into empirical methodology here, but it seems like if one were interested in figuring out which of those two mechanisms was at play in all of this previous work, that this would be probably a situation where you could check, right? So if we see, I mean, I know it's difficult because COVID is already killing a lot of people, but presumably
if you look at particular causes of death, right? I mean,
yeah. So if you see like there's, you still have these gains even in this pandemic recession, then it might suggest that it's really, because we know we've turned off a lot of the home stuff, right? So the only thing that is presumably left is the things that are happening at the macro level. So the fewer cars on the road and so on. And so if a lot of the gain is really coming from those fewer accidents, then that should probably be borne out in the data. It'd be very difficult, I suppose, because the virus itself is causing
confounding factor.
Yeah, lots of confounding effects.
I wonder a little bit. So the other line of work in this area is looking at kind of what happens to you when you lose your job, perhaps identified, in a study that looks at mass layoff events or something like that. They usually find bad outcomes, right? Worse for your health, certainly worse for like mental health outcomes. And there are studies of there's some neat studies of just surveying people who are unemployed and asking them how they feel, how they think about their life, that kind of stuff. And there are unemployed people as a group are generally fairly unhappy and have high levels of depression.
There's also evidence of like increase in substance abuse and stuff.
Yeah.
And that seems likely to hold true. All you can do is sit around at home. Certainly on my Facebook feed, I see lots of people joking about like homeschooling had me, binge drinking at 9 a.m. or something like that,
Yeah.
You see lots of those things. It would be surprising at all to see that.
Right? Maybe it's true though, right? I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure a lot of it is exaggeration, but it's
sure.
I tried
some truth to it,
Yes.
I tried sharing a video with you guys today on this very topic. It didn't get to go through because I guess the video was too big, but it was a funny parody on the whole advice of staying home and what to do in the pandemic. And a part of it was precisely what you just said, about starting at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. drinking, whether or not you're homeschooling, you're just like, they're drinking. So it seems like it seems like at least the effects of the individual studies, we would probably expect those to continue in the same direction.
I was going to say, I think I mostly agree that if I had to guess, I don't know what will happen. I mean, we're early in this, but if I had to guess, and I just think of people all avoiding a lot of social contact, right?
Yeah.
I think that sounds bad for people. They're pretty social creatures. Twitter is alive with people being like, oh, it's the era of the introvert. And maybe that's true.
Yeah.
Like the introverts are doing fine. They always wanted to live this way or something.
Yeah.
Maybe that's true. I don't even know if it's true for an introvert, but maybe it is, or more true, right? But like for most people, it's hard to feel isolated. And maybe we substitute and use Zoom and try to feel less isolated, but it's more isolating, clearly. You get a lot of energy just by being around people, and maybe that's what makes you happy. That sounds bad. We're going to do a lot of social isolation. There's going to be some people that really struggle with that, and it wouldn't be terribly shocking to find higher rates of depression and all of the ills that go along with that, like substance abuse, and maybe worse things too, right? So that's possible. Another thing, though, if we're looking for maybe reasons why it might not be as bad, but I don't know if it really is that normally, I think part of the reason why people are so sad when they lose their job, okay, it's not just that they lose some important part of their identity in life. That's awful, of course, but not everybody feels that way about their job, I guess. It's also, though, that there's so much social status associated with employment and so much social shaming or judgment associated with unemployment. And I wonder, during something like coronavirus, where you're supposed to stay at home and not go to work, is it easier to lose your job? You're just like, well, I was technically supposed to quit my job and stay at home until this is all over. And so what's the problem?
So the social stigma of losing your job is basically reduced, right? Maybe close to zero.
So if that's true, maybe it's not, if you have to lose your job, maybe you'd rather lose it during a giant recession when everybody loses their job than all by yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Oh yeah. I think a lot of the early papers on early research on say layoffs and lemons, like when you're just a part of some kind of mass layoff, it's not like you've been singled out as someone who is just bad at a job. Right. You'd much rather be a part of your, nope, big exogenous factor had nothing to do with you. You're a part of the one of the many. But so just beyond health, I guess, I think what we're turning our attention here to a little bit is just what are the other things people do with their time? And I think this gets to one of the things that we wanted to talk about from the beginning, which was one of the things they used to do with their time was go to college, right? But that's another thing that has been substantially altered, right? So maybe that'd be the next thing. What is it that we know about how do recessions affect college enrollment?
So I love this one as a topic, as do we all, because it's kind of our line of work. Mm-hmm. Just as for doing advertising, I think you should go to college. It's a good idea. Pays the bills in my house and so on. But
that's good defensible advice, right? There's a big wage premium that comes with getting a college. It's a pretty robust one. Holds up to all sorts of control variables and.
it's not only about my well-being, it'll help you too.
It is perhaps the easy way out for most people, is go to college.
So what happens in recessions historically? So I think there's a similar, there's a kind of literature that's a little bit like what we just talked about with recessions in your health. Like, what's the correlation between unemployment rates and health? We could also ask, what's the correlation between unemployment rates and college enrollment levels or education activity more generally? And this one is a little bit noisier, but I think there's evidence again that when unemployment rates go up, college enrollments tend to go up as well. Okay, and here, like, one study that's kind of interesting tries to look at college enrollment rates against national unemployment rates, over time, and we're talking about college enrollment of undergraduate aged people. There are other studies that look at graduate students and stuff. When you look at this undergraduate aged population, a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate tends to increase college enrollment by about 2%. It's pretty big when measured that way.
That's a big
yeah, a normal recession probably, I'd say, I don't know actually what you should declare the amount, but like in a recession, you might see like a 4 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate could happen, right? Maybe more than that. So, college enrollment could go up a fair amount because of a recession historically. Just like with the mortality rates, there's a lot of conflicting, that's just kind of a weird correlation. It's the product of a bunch of underlying things that, forces that affect people's decisions. So you're getting a net result that could change, of course, if conditions are different. So when you hit a recession, you're thinking about going to college, the stories are things like, well, what else am I going to do with my time? Can't get a job, might as well go to school. So the opportunity cost of your time, which is one of the reasons you might decide not to go to college today, is that you can get a good paying job right now, so why bother, right? That's no longer true. You can't get a good paying job right now, so you might as well go to college. What else are you going to do? Stay home and play video games? Maybe. Could be a good idea. There are better video games now than ever before.
And you can be a professional video game player. So
not even make money. I don't know. Sports are out the window. Maybe esports are the thing. But whatever. That's one story. The opportunity cost falls. Can't get a job. Might as well go to school. It's one mechanism. At the same time, though, if you're an undergrad aged person and the unemployment rate goes up, the economy is doing badly, right? Maybe your parents lose their job and can't afford to pay your tuition right now, or you don't have any money, or whatever. So income and wealth might take a big hit, and that might make it hard for people to afford to go to college. At the same time, the universities might get big budget cuts from their state governments, and they actually might increase tuition. So the price of college might even go up during a recession, and that'll make it harder for people to go. On the other side, often in a big recession, the federal government will come in, or state governments will come in and pass laws that give temporarily very generous student aid or student loans. Makes it easier to go to college. So all these things kind of blend together, and then you get a net result. And the net result historically, like averaged across lots of different recessions, and has been this relationship that when you see a 1 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate, you get about a 2% increase in college enrollment rates. So one take on the coronavirus epidemic is that colleges might do great, but the colleges are not acting like it's going to be boom time for enrollment so far. So maybe they don't believe that. And I think there's lots of reasons why it might be different this time, but we should talk about that. Why would it be different this time?
Yeah, so presumably a lot of times with the normal recession is that there's usually some associated restructuring of the economy, so to speak, right? Like, there's been a collapse in the banking sector, or well, actually that's a pretty common one, but the tech boom followed by the crash. You have some kind of instance in which it makes sense from a skills perspective that maybe now is the time to do some retraining, right? You've got the landscape has changed for you. You should maybe invest in having a different set of skills. And that's not super obvious at the moment what that would be. It's not like a specific problem has emerged that says that, banking is not as good as writing software is not as good as we previously thought. There's not a structural problem that's obvious to solve that's inducing this recession, I guess.
But might people view the healthcare sector as one that is maybe undersupplied, and therefore see that as an opportunity for training? I mean, maybe they think the undersupply is just it's really a peak.
At the same time, though, working in the healthcare sector has never looked worse, though. Like as a thing to do. Goodness.
Well,
it depends how you think about it.
Huh?
It depends on what you mean. So again, a job is probably some kind of package of amenities, right? Things you like about it, things you don't like about it, right?
Yeah.
So the healthcare job at the moment, right? All of a sudden, it always had risks, but all of a sudden, if you're like a nurse or a doctor or like a nursing aide or some kind of tech, all these, there's a million health occupations, right? They're all probably in demand at the moment, right? They always had risks, but now they come with a nice dollop of coronavirus risk that they didn't used to have. And so that's what you mean, Justin, right? You're like, the last thing you'd want to do in this era when we reopen is be a dental hygienist. You'd be like, that's a fantastic way to get coronavirus, right?
Maybe I won't get to live with my family for a month. That's great.
Awesome, right? Exactly. So those are all bad things. On the other hand, I think the social status of healthcare workers at the moment is pretty high. They seem heroic and helpful. Really are, saving the world a little bit, right? That's so if you're thinking like, what do I want from a job? It's true. Most people do not want high risk of death in a job, but they like high pay. Maybe they like a job that society looks fondly on and thinks is beneficial. Maybe they like the opportunity to genuinely help people or make a difference. So maybe health occupations have become more exciting for those reasons.
Yeah, I was thinking about, so in terms of Justin's comment on, is there some kind of restructuring of the economy? And I agree, I don't see a general restructuring of the economy, but it's possible that this has raised, gaps in the supply of certain skills. So yes, it could be directly in the health sector where you are the one in the hospital treating patients and so on, but maybe even in labs, right? So where you're simply testing people, or if you are in the business of producing medical supplies, ventilators and all this kind of stuff. So maybe on the higher end, I suppose throughout the entire supply chain, but presumably there are higher end types of opportunities that people probably didn't know about before that now become super salient and might be attractive to some people who are looking into college.
Those are good points. I wonder, along those same lines, is it so clear that we're not going to see some fairly substantial restructuring of the economy? Let's think about some things that might make us think this way, right? So one, we've talked a lot about different kinds of ways that during the kind of lockdown period, you got to substitute all different parts of your life. You don't go to the gym anymore, got to run at home, got to go for a run outside, buy a treadmill. You're going to eat at restaurants less often. Maybe you'll eat at food trucks more often eventually, or just cook a lot from home and buy more grocery store items. Maybe you will watch more Netflix and go to fewer movies in the theater, which you were already shifting towards. More aggregate level things. It doesn't seem a huge stretch to think that supply chains are apt to become less internationally distributed and more domestically focused. That's a pretty large restructuring if it actually happened. If we're gonna rig things up and have less immigration, that too could be a large restructuring. So I don't know that anything these things will happen, but it doesn't go without saying that we're not going to see like quite a large restructuring of the economy along the lines of like a lot of these little substitutions that are going to happen to think, even when this epidemic is over, I think people will be more aware of the risk of like a contagion of some sort, right? And the risk that different kinds of business models or social practices expose us to, and maybe we'll do less of those things. That might imply a lot of restructuring.
So
well,
it might not. Yeah, I was going to say it might not manifest as a big restructuring of the economy. Although I guess eventually it will get to that. So the idea is that I might now start to consider the potential risk of some form of employment, and then select my education, make my education choices based on, hey, you know, like working in a restaurant, whether as a manager or even owning a restaurant, is now incredibly more risky in expectations because certain types of risks that I didn't pay a lot of attention to in the past suddenly become salient. So now I choose a job where I can easily stay home if I need to and avoid all the associated risks that might.
You didn't even view that as much of an advantage before, but now you view it as a real perk.
Exactly. You didn't see that before, and now it is. So that would be one kind of mechanism.
Well, at least the restructuring that we're talking about here seems like the type of restructuring our economy tends to be really good at, right? The idea of, you know, like it's very similar to the kind of creative destruction that we talk about in other settings, right? So it's like, well, instead of, you know, a couple of dine-in restaurants, you've got, you know, food trucks surrounding a park, and, you know, that sounds lovely. You know, so like that seems like the type of thing that is quite customary in the kind of normal kind of churning of the economy. What's kind of interesting about this is that, like, one of the big stories that came out of the Great Recession was like the skill bias technological change, right? That the recession was particularly hard on lower skilled worker, high cap. It was easier for people in the higher human capital sector. I can't think of what term we used for it. And this might be kind of like the opposite, right? Because now you hear more stories about the frontline worker, so to speak, right? Which tends to be like the people running the grocery stores. And that's going to be probably the easier place to accommodate. It's not very hard to imagine Kroger's or the other retailers expanding the size of the grocery section, right? That's the type of thing that they'll be relatively good. It was hard to, you know, retrain people from being one type of, you know, from being a housing construction worker into being a different type of construction worker. That was a slower, takes a long time to kind of adjust in that way.
Okay, I think that's a good way of thinking about this. So one big pattern that labor economists have talked about a lot, you know, in the last 20 years, is this idea of skill bias technological change, which basically suggests we've had technological innovations, computers and automation mainly people are thinking about. We've invented these new computers, and computers do different things, have different implications for different kinds of workers. So if you're a very high skill worker, the computer makes you even more productive. That's how it's played out, right? So if we take an economist who read all the textbooks from the 1960s and 70s and then give them modern computing, they're like hilariously productive. They could do much more fancy regressions than they ever could before, right? Is like a baby example, kind of, right? But it's like a multiplier for them. And so the productivity and therefore the wage opportunities associated with that high skill worker, they've grown over time because of the technology. At the low end of the labor market, computers and automation often act as like skill replacing technologies. So it's not that you take a worker and pair them up with a machine or a computer. It's that you get a machine and get rid of the worker, and the machine does the whole job, kind of, right? Or you used to have 50 workers, now you have like one guy and a machine, right? And it does the entire thing, right? And so it's very good for high skill workers, makes them more productive. It's quite bad for low skill workers, makes them less productive, and maybe they should go to school. That's one story. Another story that has similar implications is that we've had more globalization, more international trade. And if we're looking for low education labor as an input to some production process, the cheapest place to go get that low education labor is usually some much poorer country. It's not in the US. So I wonder that these two things, right? If we're going post-coronavirus, one story is we might not want to do so much international production, in which case the demand for low education workers in the US might actually go up, which would reduce demand for college, because for the first time in 50 years, there's actually rising demand for low education workers. Could be good, could reduce income inequality. I don't know about technology. The other version is that we don't want to go internationally anymore, so we might double down on our race to get as many automated production processes into place as possible.
Yep.
I'm not sure how that would play out really, but there, you know, like if you can do enough skill bias technological change stuff, maybe you won't need to shift demand for low education workers. I don't know if there's anything to.
It's if I were to think completely futuristic here, it would be, getting automated delivery. So you have, what do I mean by this? So you have lots of stores now offering curbside delivery, right? So you order online, you show up, and they take the things out and they put it in your car. What if that were done through automation, right? So a robot comes out, come to your particular station, you take your things, you're gone. So it'd be something like this, but that's certainly, I imagine
so in the moment,
in some
Kroger has
small
these
capacity, but I imagine people might be thinking about how to scale up those kinds of things.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Like the grocery store and Amazon, right, and places like that. It seems like for the moment they have like huge demand for people who can be delivery truck drivers, work in a warehouse, stock the grocery store, these kinds of things, right? Those are all low to medium education workers that we mainly need in those jobs, right? But if given enough time, they're like, you know what's better than a lot of low education workers? Self-driving trucks and some drones.
Autonomous vehicles.
Those are wicked. So if that, maybe it'll spur on that kind of innovation. It won't be so great, and you'll still have to go to college. It's hard to say.
But it just occurred to me that we've spent a lot of time discussing what people might do once they go to college. So let's say degree choices. Do I go in some technical area, or do I still stick to other areas that are not as well paying? But how might the recession actually affect the decision to go in the first place, not what I do conditional on going? And so it seems like everything that you mentioned to us from the previous literature kind of exists now. So we have rising unemployment, we have reduction in the opportunity cost of going to college, we have parents losing significant amounts of wealth, potentially losing their jobs. So all those factors seem to still exist. What's different is kind of what is the university offering this time around. In the past, I suppose you could say, well, what the university was offering throughout the Great Recession and prior recessions was a product that was pretty much, somewhat constant across throughout those recessions. Yes, there are some budget cuts, but you still have a physical campus, you still have sports teams, you still have events, you still have face-to-face classes. Not so much in COVID. So I guess the speculation is that we're now comparing all the previous factors to a product.
Plus a big change in the college bundle. Like, what do you get when you buy college?
Yes.
Now you just get some online classes. You used to get classes, dorms, drunken parties, football games and basketball games, random opportunities to find yourself and develop a new identity. Now you just get like video lectures from Coady and Denvil and Justin.
Well, that's right. So, to some extent, I think there's pretty good research on like the role of like network effects, right? Like one way to describe it is like what the university does. It gives you this opportunity to like reconstitute who your peer group is. Like the friends I had in college did not resemble the friends I had in high school, right? You can move this, right? So like when they look at like those in those studies where they look at like the effect of joining on a frat or a sorority, you know, it's something equal to like a 1.5 GPA wise, or some massive effect. And it's particularly large for like first generation students, people who are previously out of the network, so to speak, you know. So like, and certainly
when you say 1.5, you mean
like
for a low SES student at the starting point, joining a frat increases their post-college earnings by about the same amount as doing better in school by like 1 GPA point. Is that what you mean? Something
yeah.
like that?
It's quite large, right? And it's heterogeneous, and it's largest for the people who were less likely to just have that in their network, right? If you were coming from, say, the well-connected rich family anyway, those type of networks didn't really do as much for you as if you were like the first generation student. Yeah, it's much larger for those type of people who are now getting that. And so you think, like, in terms of if this avenue, this pathway is closed off through universities, right, then it's a particular shock in terms of what it is that the universities can offer.
I like this.
That's
line
probably
of
something
thought.
we have to get back.
Do you think so? So here's two things. There is this like literature. It maybe has a certain ring of truth to it, but it's also a little bit cynical, maybe in its view. But there's this literature that looks at, you know, what causes students to go to one college versus the other, and they're always having funny titles about, you know, what's the effect of having a lazy river at your university. Yeah. Or like a fancy gym. So meaning the universities, to compete with one another, will invest in silly luxuries and amenities that attract college-age people. Like all schools have a nice library, but do they have a lazy river? Wow, let's go to the one with the lazy river, right? You can see why someone would want this. Yeah. Like I get all the same things plus lazy river. Yes, on the margin, right? No problem. It's like it's a kind of like you know, country club style amenity that's gotten grafted onto the college. And as people talk about this, and they're like, isn't that disgusting? Shouldn't do those things, right? Yeah. And the colleges are like, I don't know, I'm trying to attract students. Students like things. What do you want? You know, that's one view. And if that's partly what students are coming to college for, they get a degree and human capital or signaling or whatever they're coming for. But plus, they're consuming the experience of going to a kind of country club for a while. That's one thing. And if we do have shift to online classes, what we've done is basically substantially worsened the quality of the product because we're not offering all that stuff. Another view, though, that Justin is suggesting, I think, is that earlier view about country clubs and it's all very disgusting and wasteful, right, is overly cynical, and that those things might actually be a bigger part of the human capital bundle that is college than we realize. That maybe the way that you produce a high wage benefit of college is partly by teaching people history classes and calculus classes and economics classes, but it's also partly by providing them all these networking opportunities, right? Yeah. It could be both blended together. It's hard. We don't know a lot about how it's really conceived. But if that's true, the lazy river might be more part of that than you realize. Maybe that's a place where you go and hang out and meet people, and that could be a huge part of it. If the people never go and hang out and meet anyone, maybe they get half the rate of return to college that they used to. That's a disturbing thought, that even if they all come, the wage premium to college for this vintage of graduates could be worse. If that's true, we weakened the model.
I wanted to.
I hope that's not true. That sounds terrible.
Yeah. Those are all good factors that I think might affect the decision to enroll. Let's say at least in the short run being fall 20. So we might see some serious effects for this fall 20 period. But I guess the question is, should we see a big effect for the fall 20 period, and how much of that might be driven by expectations for what the 4-year period will look like, right? So we're saying the quality of the product might be diminished if we are suddenly taking away the lazy river, the dorm, all the meetings where people meet and interact. But if that's only for one semester, then the 4-year period is still overwhelmingly positive. So I guess a lot of this will depend on people's expectations of how much of those 4 years will be sitting in front of a computer
damaged
at my parents' house versus it's a semester and then in January we will all be on campus kind of continuing as if.
Coupled with these same kind of mechanisms is, of course, like all the other activities we've been talking about in today's conversation, is just the fact that going to college right now carries with it a health risk that it didn't previously carry. You got to go there and expose yourself potentially to coronavirus. College students maybe seem like, not very risk averse individuals, though universities and parents seem like pretty risk averse people. So that their willingness to have the students come here during this situation in the first place, if they're the universities, and the willingness of parents to sign their kids up for something like that, a live college experience, if it's epidemiologically risky, might be pretty low.
Yeah.
What do you have a guess? So like the historical evidence says if it was just a big recession, if anything, enrollment should go up. The out of sample thing here is that we might change the product and shift online. Will people still sign up? And I guess there's two things. What about students who are coming from high school and they'll be the new entering class? Are they gonna, is the size of the new entering class gonna like just drop like a stone? Or is it gonna go up, which is what would be predicted by the recession literature? And then another question is, right, among people that are already students, they're in second year, third year, fourth year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will the continuation rates go down or go up? Are they gonna, if you're already here, do you stay enrolled for next year even if we go online? Or are a bunch of you gonna take a year off or drop out entirely or whatever? What do you actually think is gonna happen, given that we're changing the bundle, but there's the recession effect that might be pushing in another direction?
So I think, I guess my guess you have to take with huge lumps of salt and also some qualifiers, right? So the one thing that we've not touched on yet is the fact that there was already expectations of an enrollment decline, right? So we had this pre-existing condition of the enrollment cliff that people mentioned. So I suppose the question is
just because of the size of the birth cohorts, basically.
Yeah, because they were just, so this is a lingering effect of the last recession, right? And so I guess the question is, will the decline we experience now, how will that decline compare to the decline we were expecting? My guess is that we will have serious declines for fall 20. And this is for the entering classes, is the part that I'm more talking about. And I think a lot of this, my guess is that this will be driven not so much by the added risk of being on campus, so the COVID, the risk of being infected, but more driven by uncertainty over how the fall semester will be handled. So my sense is that the sooner that gets cleared up, the better we'll be able to predict what will happen. But as it continues to linger, will I have classes on campus or will I be sitting at home? Then we have to consider, well, will someone travel, an international student coming in? So we probably will see significant drops there. Probably not worth it. But we also have non-resident students having to decide, do I enroll to IU when I'll be taking classes online? Well, why not just enroll to the university in my state? So that's the out-of-state movement of students. So if I had to guess, I would say for fall 20, we will probably see significant declines in enrollment. I'm not sure what happens for spring or fall 21.
So it seems like a reasonable prediction. I think one way to consider it, though, is in terms of like, it might depend greatly on who you are and what it was that you were selling, right? So like IU, you can think of as being a place that's kind of in the middle of the pack here, right? Like you would come in and be, if you come in as a freshman, right, you have to live on campus. And so there's like an on-campus experience. It's very much something that gets ingratiated in like a Hoosier student, right? so some of that is going to get lost because of this pandemic recession. That's not as much of a part of the bundle. But that was a huge part of the bundle for many other campuses, right? Why do people go to the fancier College of Arts school that's $50,000 a year? They are very much more on that experience. Like you think like the Notre Dames, for example, to some extent, but just the fancy small, the Juilliards, or maybe not Juilliard, but the small fancy College of Arts school. Like who's going to pay that kind of tuition to just take online classes from like a Beloit College or a Kenyon College? They were selling like the small personal experience, exactly the thing that you find now at the highest potential. You'll get some small classes if you go to a school like Arizona State or Indiana University or Ohio State. You'll also get some massive classes, right? They're going to get all moved online. But that was like the primary product for this. Like, so if you're thinking about like what looks like the bigger risk now, the College of Arts, the small liberal arts colleges look like a huge risk, because you're paying a massive amount for that on-campus experience where you're getting that very different peer network. And so from that perspective, you might just go, well, I'll just start out at a place like, like a Big Ten school. And then if I get that back, then I can still get that network back. I can get that on-campus experience back, right? And that was something that was always on the table before, but I have to think like the relative advantages have shifted quite considerably.
So you're not thinking a decline, or maybe
well, I mean, so that's the thinking. Like overall, there could be a decline, right? But it's not like necessarily that you think that's going to be a 10% reduction at every campus. Right?
Yeah. Some places will do worse than others.
Yeah. So ours being like in Indiana University might be somewhat offset because we're picking up the people that otherwise would have gone to like Wabash College. People who go to Wabash, they're Wabashers for life. After that, that's definitely like a big cultural experience that is why people will pay, 6 or 7 times the tuition of an IU or I shouldn't quote the numbers, I guess, because I don't know exactly what the difference in tuition is, right? But it's substantially more to go to a Wabash versus like an IU.
Right? Yeah.
And you no longer want to sit in a tiny little classroom. If there's a coronavirus risk, right?
Yes, I suppose.
It's a good point. It's not. Yeah, it's. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that's a good point. It's that the overall the drop in country level enrollment, so just across the entire country, might actually not fall. So there might not be a reduction in enrollment, but the distribution of that enrollment, you suspect, will change significantly.
Yeah, I mean, I like you. I think we're expecting a decline in enrollment somewhat anyway. Yeah. I think that. So the question is like the counterfactual. Will it be even worse? I'm not so sure it'll be that much worse relative to the counterfactual. People will maybe be starting out more online in the fall. Like that seems like a pretty good guess.
Yeah.
So like if you think about that. Go ahead.
I think I mean, I agree. It's very hard to know. I'm curious to see what will happen. I want to run regressions on these things, but I feel like I don't know I don't know exactly how to get myself nice out of sample estimates of what it would mean to so drastically alter the package. Like would it be enough if I got coefficients on whether the college has nice dorms or doesn't have nice dorms, residential amenities, not residential amenities. If I could get all those things and then I just turn off all of those facts, would I get the result? I think no, right? Like I think it is too janky. But so I don't have a good way of guessing. I do think, and so it seems very plausible to me that lots of people will not go. I wouldn't blow my mind or anything. There's part of me that thinks though, what else? Like if I were a high school student right now, I had been planning to go to college, it would feel pretty disappointing that I can't have the thing that I wanted to have in the first place. So some students might feel that way. But I also think I'm kind of a workaholic, and coronavirus has not really changed that. And I was a little bit like that maybe in high school in the sense that like I really did not enjoy being bored. And so like something like coronavirus lockdown for teenage version of me would have been awful. I'd have been like, oh my God, we're just here all day long, hanging out. And like, granted, there's better video games today than there were, perhaps, and they're more socially interactive, so maybe I would like them better. But like, it would probably be awful. And so maybe I'd be looking for any way to just like have another part of my life. And maybe college would satisfy that role, even if it was a shadow of its normal self. Like, I don't get to go to this new location and live there and have a completely transported experience from my normal life. But maybe you just want other activities, and you can't really go work because you're just a kid anyway, but also employment opportunities are not great. So maybe demand for college goes up simply because as an alternative to lounging about all day long, college would be better. That's a bleak way of describing why a person would want to go to college, I realize. Yeah. But I mean, there's much more to college. It's a beautiful place. You should come to college. But like it is an antidote to boredom in certain ways as well, isn't it?
Well,
I mean,
that kind of analysis also applies at the other end of the enrollment spectrum, right? So like here we were just talking about new students enrolling. But the other end of like when we're thinking about like the number of students enrolled, some of those are students who hang on for longer than you otherwise might expect, right? So like continuing on into short-term graduate programs, or maybe deciding to extend into a double major. If you're a few credits short, you might extend to go do the fifth or sixth year option. And I think there's work on this side of it as well, right? We know something from the previous recessions about people extending the college experience in one way or another.
That's right. I mean, there's totally a lot of work that looks at, or at least there's a chunk of economic research that looks at the opposite end of the conversation we've been having. What's the effect of graduating from college into a bad economy, into a recession, right? And like, it's bad. Like, it's not a good time to graduate from college, basically. I mean, you don't get to choose generally, so like, what are you gonna do? But cohorts that come out of college in periods where unemployment rates are high, they have a harder time getting a job, takes them longer to get a job. They often end up taking a job where the starting salary is lower, the starting wage level is lower than cohorts that came out when their unemployment rate was lower. Mm-hmm. It seems like they get sorted. There's some evidence that the jobs they get tend to be in, somebody who has a particular degree might end up in several different like job types, occupations. And if you graduate during a recession, you often end up in a lower, less upwardly mobile occupation set than you do if you come out in a better economy. So all those things have immediate, bad outcomes for people, but they also hang around. You end up on a sort of permanently lower growth curve. You see effects that are persistent for quite a number of years post-graduation. You do see people, there's studies out there which say like, you also see people are more likely to go and do a graduate degree if they were graduating from an undergraduate program into a recession. They're more likely to just go pick up a master's degree. So
universities are responsive on this front, right? Like, I think our school, for example, I think is looking for ways to make it cheaper for students to stick around and continue. That's right.
Maybe extending the enrollment or application deadline because now we're in this case. So maybe there's a group of undergrads that hadn't originally planned to go immediately, but now we court them a little bit more, and maybe they're on the margin of saying yes or something like that. So I mean, those are all. I don't know what you should do about that. I mean, maybe you could take refuge at the university. That's the first argument if you can't find a job. It's hard to think about like how someone should adapt to this. It is probably the reality of the situation. There's going to be a bunch of people that are graduating from college right into a epidemic plus a hangover recession that follows the epidemic for a while. Not going to go on forever. Eventually, we'll have some catch-up growth and it'll be good times again. But there's a cohort of people that'll be right in the thick of it. I'm not sure. Like, what's advice for how do you make the best of a bad job market, what are you supposed to do? Go back to school maybe is one story, but do you have other ideas? What's an economist supposed to think of a situation where the employment prospects are dim?
Oh yeah, that is the go-to one, right? Human capital investment. Figure out like what is the better match for your skill. Yeah. It is perhaps, you know, like one of the things that seems like it's popular from this experience is people taking the time to try and reflect on themselves and think about what are the ways I can improve, right? What are the ways, like what should I do? And it's not always like necessarily linked to the job market per se, right? But it is things like, you know, I really always wanted to learn a language, or I really always wanted to get this or that together. And so it wouldn't be surprising if some of those things ended up, you know, at least indirectly being kind of correlated with this. Like now's the time to
that's like
get
kind
better
of the
at
antidote to boredom argument too. Like maybe
time to finish
there'll
my
be
novel.
high demand.
You know,
there you go. That's interesting. Or you know, universities, the demand for kind of lifelong learning style courses at universities that are targeted at, you know, non-traditional college students, but just like, you know, IU Bloomington has a number of, you know, mini classes that it puts on in the summertime and things like that are mainly targeted at retired people, right? They have to come and take like a 2-day class in something, or so I wonder if demand for things like that will go up, even if it's online. It goes up because you're just like, well, what am I going to do all day?
It won't surprise me if there ends up being a little bit of an uptick in interest in like civically oriented kind of positions, like the nonprofit that is going to go out and do well, perhaps even the public sector at you know, like seeing the amount of things that local governments actually do to really help hold society together, I think really kind of becomes more apparent in times like this. Like the different ways in which you can kind of see the people who are employed by your local government as public servants, you know, where that label really starts to seem to apply. It wouldn't be surprising if you started seeing people viewing them as more role models for those types of people who are now doing that kind of reflection.
So you mean this is an option as opposed to just taking the opportunity to go to college?
Yeah, well, yeah. So I was thinking in terms of like, what is it that they might want to do with themselves? Thinking about like something beyond,
yeah,
you know, all maybe otherwise someone who might have been like, well, trying to get into sales, you know, or trying to take over the family grocery store or something, but getting to see an opportunity where you do, you know, in the midst of all the things that are horrible that you see, you also do see a lot of like really quite lovely stories in which you start recognizing the importance of positions that otherwise kind of always flown under the radar.
Yeah,
that's a really nice upside. I think there's some truth to this. Maybe it often seems to me that when you are certainly like when you are a small child, it feels like your experience of the world is there's mostly like a tiny number of jobs, like 4 jobs or something. There's like fireman, policeman, doctor. Yeah. You know, I mean, like these are the jobs. Yeah. Garbage man, mailman. Right? That's like you got a kind of a small world, and there's these like really typecasty roles where people wear like a uniform and stuff, right?
And drive big vehicles.
Yeah, exactly. They love this, right? It's very gendered. So, I mean, and then as you get older, like you go through high school, it expands a little bit. You know what your parents do, or maybe your friends' parents do a little bit. It's much vaguer. But basically, the typical teenager who's choosing what to study, they don't know very many jobs at all, right? I mean, like they have no idea, hardly any exposure to the many different things people do, you know, with their lives. So any shock that you could have, which would give people a broader set of examples and types to think like, no, I could do that, or I could do this other thing. That seems beneficial, right? And it's true, like this particular event, the epidemic, surely has shifted the spotlight onto some types of career paths that normally would be like invisible to a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old, right? Like epidemiologist, right? Like I'd never heard of an epidemiologist probably when I was in high school, right? So now they're on the news all the time, right? Talking. I guess lots of it is medical. Maybe it's hard to distinguish an epidemiologist from just like a generic doctor, hospital type person, scientist. But it gives exposure to that sort of public health crowd.
Probably have never heard teachers more praised than at the current moment, right?
You think so?
I think so.
Because they're teaching online, you mean?
No, I just mean like everybody, now that everybody is homeschooling to some degree.
Oh,
like, man, teachers are a wonderful occupation. Really raise the status of that group right now, right?
Yeah, the status of doctors, medical professions, status of teachers. I mean, like you kind of truly see the value added of
these often I guess we don't generally undervalue doctors. Maybe we have been, but they're pretty wealthy and high status. But teachers.
So one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about is with the existing empirical evidence on the effect of recessions on students who are graduating is that you have this, yes, there is a big negative effect, and that negative effect tends to last for roughly 10 years is quite common from what I've read in the empirical literature. But there's also a disparity in the magnitude of that effect, right? So depending on the degree choices of students, and so, students in degrees that tend to have high wage premiums to begin with tend to suffer less. They also recover much faster relative to those who are graduating with degrees that don't have as large of a wage premium to begin with. And it strikes me that just as with the health piece, it seemed, well, not so much the health, but the enrollment study that we just talked about, that with the students graduating during the recession, it seems like those effects will carry over perfectly with COVID, if not with much bigger negative effects. But then the question arises as to the implication this has for inequality going forward, right? So at least the difference between students of different degrees. And it seems like we would expect that gap to increase. So there is this kind of income inequality effect that comes from this shock, because some are placed on a permanently lower wage profile or wage trajectory relative to some other students who are also on a lower trajectory, but because of that gap that exists in the effect of the pandemic, that kind of then widens over time. So it seems like that's maybe not so much a difference, but more so a potential exaggeration coming out of the current pandemic.
I guess it's not clear to me, just because, like we talked earlier about the direction of the skill bias seems to be different before. Now all of a sudden, a lot of these kind of jobs are more front lines of running the grocery store. Grocery stores are now paying like time and a half, things like that. But then on the other hand, you've got the jobs that where people can telecommute. They're what's before them allows them that option to telecommute, and then those who do not. So I guess I could see it running a little bit in either direction.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Although the grocery person wouldn't be graduating with a degree, but yeah, I do see. So to the extent that so I guess the question is, which of the current jobs get most impacted by the virus?
Well,
right?
To the extent that college education seems to be a fairly significant driver of income inequality, right? Yeah. That seems to do a decent amount of the work for all the reasons we said before. Like we've had all this long skill bias, technological change, globalization, and so on, that somewhat sees to exacerbate that. If this clamps down on that, then that would run in the other direction. But
I guess the question is whether you expect this. I agree with you, what you said at the top, Denvil, that of the three, the three big buckets of things we talked about today are like, what's the effect of recessions on your health? What's the effect of recessions on number of people who go to college? Mm-hmm. And then, what's the effect of recessions on people who are graduating from college, right? That third one, I agree with what you said, or what I think you said, which is that coronavirus might be pretty different from the historical correlations we've seen for those first two questions. Effects on mortality rates could be pretty different this time because the coronavirus might kill people too. Effects on college enrollment might be different because we massively changed the bundle, right? Mm-hmm. Now it's going to be all online. You can't go in the lazy river anymore, right? That could make it different. But the third one, you're graduating in a time when no one is trying to hire any workers, right? That sounds about the same as the other recessions. It doesn't seem uniquely suited to the coronavirus case, or different in the coronavirus case, except maybe this more speculative angle that maybe there'll be some more fundamental change or amplifying. I don't even really know what seems most likely to me, but amplifying of the existing trends. So one story that seems very interesting to think harder about is, do we think that post-coronavirus, that the shift, that we're more worried about communicable diseases and epidemics, or even if we're just worried about this particular epidemic, does that increase the demand for low education workers? Meaning, does it kind of reverse some of the, last 20 years skill bias technological change trend, plus the international trade globalization shift to buying cheap labor in other countries? Does it push back against that, which shifts demand for low skill workers and maybe narrows the wage premium to college, narrows the gap between how much college workers get paid and how much non-college workers get paid? It doesn't sound totally ludicrous when you frame it up like that. But another story is that it just doubles down on it even harder. Like we'll come back and it's dangerous to even be in a workplace. You don't want to have a factory where you've got a bunch of workers sitting beside each other. That's a great way to get them all infected. Let's replace them all with machines and social distance the place. In which case that would amplify or speed up, accelerate the existing trend towards automation and things like that. So both of those stories sound a little plausible to me. I don't really know. I mean,
it's a tough one because I'm thinking kind of 2 points. One is the effect of this shock. So among those who are graduating, the effect of the shock on the distribution of income or income disparity among college educated folks. And then there is the effect of the shock on just the distribution of income across the entire population. Mm-hmm. And so, I agree, if we see an increase in the demand for low skilled workers, at the same time, we're seeing a negative effect on those who are college educated, that we might actually see a closing of that gaps to some degree. But if the demand for the low skilled workers is limited to having one person who can be on the front line versus having many of them on the front line, because you still are concerned about contagion. So it's not like you could hire an army of baggers at the grocery store, just as an example. You still need just one who will do things and then get it to the customers. Then you might actually have a negative shock even for those folks. Those who work will get higher pay, but there are very fewer of them working. And so it's a bit unclear how this might actually pan out in the end, I suppose.
We should wrap up in just a moment here, but it seems like maybe one more point that we haven't really touched on with this is that it also might change demand for the geography of things, right? So if in the post-coronavirus world is one where living in a high density city is less desirable than before, and so you want to spread it out. One of the things that has been considered a significant contributor to the income inequality and the reductions in income mobility in particular has been the ability of certain particular places with access to the economy to lock people out. So one of the stories had being San Francisco and its low building density requirements that basically prevents the new construction and expansion of places to live, basically freezes out all these people and prevents them from having access to it. or just in general, that escalates the housing prices and just kind of makes it more difficult for people to find ways to get to live where the economy is happening.
Right.
And if what this does is maybe spreads out geographically somewhat, the economy, so to speak, then that also might be another countervailing force in which, now it's a world where you don't have to live in downtown San Francisco to be able to go do this, or in Boston or wherever.
Yeah, good point. Everyone will move to the middle of the country,
That's right.
away from the coasts.
Right here in Indiana.
That's right.
It's going to be amazing.
Between climate change and the coronavirus.
That was a good place to end.
All right. Well, thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, sure.